My story begins when I was a teenager. We were next-door neighbors, and our families had been friends for generations. Everyone expected us to end up together, and honestly, we thought so too. We started dating in high school, and everything seemed perfect until I had to move to another state for my master's degree. We tried to maintain a long-distance relationship for a year, but eventually, we decided to stay friends instead. The pressure of keeping a relationship alive while being apart was too much for both of us. We dated other people. But deep down, we always knew we'd find our way back to each other someday. After graduation, I stayed in the same city and began my career. My mentor, Rick, became a good friend over time. One day, he called me into his office to share an interesting opportunity, a 3-year position in Singapore with all expenses covered. Although the pay wasn't great, I could save most of it since housing and travel were included. Rick emphasized how such an experience had helped him early in his career and encouraged me to consider it. The first year in Singapore was tough. Adjusting to a new culture and different business practices took time, but I eventually adapted. I dated casually while there, always being upfront about my temporary stay. Rick visited occasionally for work supervision, and we'd explore the city together. When my contract ended, I returned home and bought a house. Within a month, I ran into her at my parents' house. She had broken up with her boyfriend a year earlier, and we started talking regularly again. Things progressed naturally, and we began dating again. Initially, I was hesitant about getting intimate. My time in Asia had changed me, and I was worried about how it might affect our relationship. When we finally did, she noticed the difference in my experience level. She asked questions, and I wasn't entirely honest about my past relationships. This dishonesty would later come back to haunt me. Our families were overjoyed when we got back together. We moved in together, and everything seemed perfect. We planned our wedding for the summer of 2020. But then, something unexpected happened. Around New Year's, she was going over wedding details with her cousin, Arya, when she asked to talk. Arya stayed in the living room while we sat at the kitchen table. She began by asking me not to interrupt and then dropped a bombshell. She wanted an open relationship before marriage. Her reasoning? She felt insecure about our different experience levels and feared I might cheat in the future if I became unsatisfied. She laid out rules. Only strangers, no repeats, and no emotional connections. At first, I thought she was joking, but when I realized she was serious, I lost it. I yelled at Arya, accusing her of putting this idea into her head. But Arya claimed she was only there for support. My fiancé then added that I could also see other people under the same rules. When I refused and said I only wanted one person, I sarcastically pointed at Arya, hoping to provoke her. That backfired. She said it was inappropriate because Arya was family. I spent that night in the guest room, unable to sleep. The next day, she started night shifts, which gave us some space. She'd leave dinner with sweet notes, but I kept my responses short. A week later, I discovered a hotel reservation in her email. The hotel was near my office, and she was supposed to be working that night. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. I searched dating sites for anonymous profiles, but found nothing. Rick noticed something was wrong and invited me to lunch. When he suggested eating at the same hotel's restaurant, I refused and told him everything. Rick offered me unlimited leave, paid or unpaid. Later, he suggested we wait at the hotel to see if she showed up. I was hesitant but agreed because I had to know. We sat in the lobby bar, and around 6:30 p.m., Rick pointed her out. She was at the front desk, not in her nurse uniform. 10 minutes after she went up to her room, I asked the receptionist to connect me to her room. When she answered, I started yelling, telling her it was over and our relationship was done. Then I left the hotel. I stayed at Rick's place for a few days, ignoring her calls. My phone rang constantly, but I didn't answer. I only called my dad to explain briefly what had happened and told him I needed to leave town. Everyone tried reaching me, but I stayed silent. After everything fell apart, I realized I needed to handle some financial matters to protect myself. But I couldn't bring myself to think about the house, wedding loans, or car payments. I emailed her, saying I was leaving town and that everything was off. After talking with my dad again, who was disappointed but understanding, I booked a flight to Bali. I went offline except for occasional messages to work and my dad. I spent a month in Bali, mostly drinking and feeling angry and ashamed. During that time, Rick contacted me about handling some work in Singapore, mentioning rumors of lockdowns due to a new virus. I arrived in Singapore on March 1st, planning to stay for 30 to 60 days until things calmed down. Those days turned into another year before I got vaccinated, and by then, I didn't want to return home. I rented out my house and avoided any news about her when talking to my family. In September 2021, I received news that my dad had suffered a heart attack and needed triple bypass surgery. Despite my reluctance to face everyone back home, I knew I had to see him. I also wanted to thank Rick for everything he had done for me. After landing, I went straight to see my dad. He looked okay and was optimistic about the surgery. We talked for hours about everything except the heavy stuff. I didn't want to stress him out. Rick messaged me saying the company CEO wanted to see me, but it could wait given my father's condition. I decided to get it over with and went to the office. The CEO started lecturing me about responsibility and dedication. He then turned to Rick and asked why they should keep me around. Rick joked about how I worked for 20% below market rate, and they both laughed. Then the CEO got serious and shared some life advice about relationships that actually resonated with me. To my surprise, I wasn't being fired. I was getting promoted. Rick had been looking out for me all along. Afterward, Rick and I went for drinks, even though it was still morning. He convinced me that I needed to meet her for closure before I could truly move forward with my life. I unblocked her on social media and sent her a message asking to meet for dinner. She agreed, and we set a date for after her shift. I had two fears going into that meeting. Either my anger would take over, or my old feelings would resurface. I hoped to find middle ground. When she walked into the restaurant, all my plans fell apart. She looked beautiful and wore my favorite perfume. After an awkward hug, we sat down. I noticed she wasn't wearing any rings, not even the engagement ring I had given her. We started by talking about my dad. She told me she had checked on him during her hospital shifts and assured me his surgeon was one of the best. We discussed her work during COVID and my time in Singapore. Inside, I was falling apart, but I kept calm on the outside. Finally, she addressed what had happened. "I want to tell you how sorry I am for hurting you," she said. "Are you sorry you got caught, or sorry for what you did?" I asked. "I'm sorry for ruining our future. I let my insecurities destroy everything," she admitted. "Did you plan it because you felt insecure, or did you want to punish me for dating other people when we were apart?" She hesitated but admitted it might have been both. Then she told me something I never knew. Her ex before me had cheated on her because he felt he couldn't compete with her feelings for me. "I never planned for you to find out about the hotel. I thought I could keep my emotions separate, and even if you discovered it, we could work through it like we always did." "You thought wrong," I said. "It's the most painful thing I've ever experienced. I didn't need you to be perfect or experienced. I just needed you to be faithful." She went to the bathroom to compose herself. Meanwhile, Rick was in the lounge area for support, but he was busy chatting with two women. When he saw me, he gave me a thumbs up and went back to his conversation. That was just how he was. When she returned, she asked if I had any questions about that night. I told her it didn't matter anymore. She insisted that nothing had happened. She said that when I called the room, she panicked and ran to the lobby, but by the time she got there, I was already gone. "Can you forgive me?" she asked. "I already have. You're not horrible. You just made terrible choices. But it's not all your fault. I should have understood your worries better," I said. I told her about a memory from our childhood when I protected her from a stray dog. "All these years later, I still tried to protect you from everything. But this time, while I was protecting you, you stabbed me in the back." She started crying and pushed her ring box across the table. "I didn't want it. I wish I was home playing with the baby we would have had by now," I said, immediately regretting my words. After we both calmed down, we talked about the future. Since our families were close, we needed to figure out how to be around each other. Getting back together wasn't an option, but we could at least be civil. We ended with a long hug goodbye. That night helped me close that chapter of my life. Sometimes love isn't enough when trust is broken. I learned that forgiveness doesn't mean letting someone back into your life. It just means you're ready to move forward with yours.